Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Hello and welcome. So this has been a long day for me. The person I'm about to introduce you to is I'm already stumbling, and she's listening on it. But Nida Khan, कल जब मैंने इनका पोस्ट लगाया था कि आज निदा खान होंगी हमारे साथ, तो there was a bunch of messages. There were A-level students, there were the CPPD certificate course students who had messaged, and there were so many wonderful things said about therapist Nida Khan. So who is this Nida Khan? Nida Khan is a psychotherapist who has been practicing for more than a decade. She has been a clinical supervisor for over 2 years. She has a master's degree in working with children and adolescents, and so many other things. Expressive arts therapy, itni sari cheezein hain. Zainab, who was with us recently, mentioned that she's so happy that Nida is going to be on, because unki beti was did wonderful things in her therapy. So before we start talking about Nida and and everybody is getting so excited over here, let's introduce Nida. Let her introduce you to herself. Hi Nida, Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
Alaikum salam. I'm good. Happy to be here.
Finally. Some people are saying finally.
For whatever that means.
Nida, you have such a comprehensive resume with, you've done so many things in the past decade and a half. What is it that has kept you going towards therapy with children and adolescents?
I think what's kept me going in this field in general is the fact that, as far as I know, is that no 2 days really can be the same. So not only is every kind of interaction with each person so fundamentally unique, because that little space that exists between you and me, it depends on how I'm doing, how you're doing, and then that chemistry between the two of us. Not only is that not replicable, but then to think about the fact that, like, all the different permutations that exist between different people and where we're at and where they're at, that no conversation can be the same. So there's something about it that refreshes itself, to be honest. I think a lot of this is just being able to show up with curiosity and then just being amazed, just standing still and just being amazed and astonished at kind of at what emerges and happens. So it really refreshes itself, I have to say.
And that was me. I mean, just 2 months ago, I was your student, one of your students for your certificate course at CPPD, and that is what you did to me. You kept me curious and amazed to keep coming every day, even though there were some days you're like, wait, what do you mean, Nida? But it was truly such an enriching process, and I know that whomever we spoke to about this process that you have to go through, it has changed my life. This certificate course with you changed my life, and I'm really grateful that you were my instructor. So Nida, we are talking about something. We're talking about a topic which, even when we discuss it under training, we realize that it is not talked much at all. And being a Desi parent and growing up in the Desi society and Desi culture, shame, kisi ko sharminda karna, is such a negative. It gives so many negative connotations just by saying it, and yet we practice it.
It's interesting that you say that, because there are a few words that saying the word itself is kind of cringy. So there's certain kind of words that just saying those words are cringy, even if we don't explore them. And I find that, like, shame is one of those words. Is that even for people to admit they feel shame, it feels so cringy to say I feel ashamed by that. So shame is not just the experience of it, but even saying the word shame, it has such a heavy connotation that it feels cringy in the body.
And when we say shame and children, you know, and obviously I always do my research. With you, I had to do my research, and I was fortunate enough because through the course there was a couple of texts that we had read which dealt with shame, the toxicity of it, the boundaries of it. And yet, when we're talking in children, who toddlers, right from the age of 3, can start sensing the feeling of emotions such as guilt and shame, and yet we tweak them and we lure them and we, set our causes forth by shaming them. Why do you think the cycle continues?
Oh, that's a big question. Um, so, there's something you said interesting earlier where you said, guilt and shame, and you use both of those together. So I'm going to start with that actually. I think very often when parents attempt to try to make their children, or they have a desire for their children to do something differently, they want to be able to say, hey, this behavior is not appropriate or it's not okay, which makes sense. I mean, parents are there to set boundaries. Parents have to set boundaries. Nothing wrong with setting boundaries. It's healthy to set boundaries. Um, and so actually the word guilt essentially implies that like that behavior may not be appropriate. So I feel remorse for my behavior, and so I feel guilty about this thing that I did, right? And shame is so much deeper than that. Shame is not about a behavior. Shame is about identity. So guilt is, oh, I'm really sorry that I accidentally bumped into you and I didn't ask if you were passing through the door at the same time that I was, so I bumped into you. That's guilt. But shame is, oh my God, what is wrong with me? How could I have done this? I'm such a horrible human being. And so I think, interestingly, parents, they start off, I believe, with the intention of trying to say, here's this behavior that you need to change. And they end up passing on shame to their children rather than just an awareness of that behavior. And it's kind of like, what did you do over there? And like, ganda bacha, acha bacha, I mean, like, what were you thinking? And so it really becomes in a whole identity forming thing, because then it's no longer about the behavior. It's like, what is wrong with you? Not like, hey, what was happening in this instance, but what is wrong with you? And that question that you just asked of like, well, why does shame perpetuate itself? Well, what is that keeps the cycle going? There's something that we really talk about in terms of passing shame and carrying shame and how that kind of it goes forth. A lot of the key to that is what you said in the beginning. You had said, you're like, there's certain things that even when you just talk about them, they just, and I was like, shame feels cringy. Shame feels really cringy. It's difficult to live with. We spend our lives trying to find ways to remove ourselves from our shame, distracting ourselves and this and that. And if I have more accomplishments in this. So we naturally have a tendency to want to pass shame away to someplace or something. It's like, let me bury it deep inside, or let me find a really nice, convenient place to put it. Now, unfortunately, parents and children have a very, very unequal power dynamic. Children are small, parents are large. Children have very little agency, parents have this much agency. Children don't get to make a lot of decisions, parents get to make a lot of decisions. It's naturally a very unequal and imbalanced relationship. And so for adults who are carrying around shame, when it gets difficult, my child's not listening to me. What is wrong with me? I'm undermined. I'm losing control. I'm not able to keep my head in this situation. A child is being a child. If a kid's scribbling on a wall, a child's being a child. But a parent's shame gets triggered. I'm losing control over things. I can't manage my own house. This child is supposed to be my own image. I've created this kid. How can this kid not be cutting me a break? And when that shame comes up, that beautifully imperfect power dynamic just lends itself to say, well, here's this basket that I can dump it in. So it's kind of like, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? You're writing on the wall. You make life miserable. So a lot of it has to do with that kind of unequal power dynamic that is unfortunately present in all parent-child relationships. So if the adult is unaware of the fact that that's happening, they'll just shove it right onto the child.
And so exactly what you said, it is stemming from inside of us. So it is triggering a lot of the unattended shame that we've buried inside ourselves, which just keeps stemming up, and it brings out the behaviors that we cannot keep a lid on, or cannot address, or cannot attend to. And then it's the language. The first thing that when I was thinking about, when how are we dealing with our children, and especially in the dynamic of Desi culture, the language of shame is so dynamic in so many different fronts, because it's we're not just talking about guilt, we're talking about social shame, sexual shame in terms of puberty and masturbation and codependency. Oh, you can't do this, let me do it for you. And
Yeah.
it's just like we don't want to allow them to give themselves permission to make their mistakes, and us to be able to see them through it.
Yeah. Well, there's something interesting, isn't there, in that? So, parenthood is you're a parent, you already know this. Your parenthood can be a really beautiful journey. But there's something about the decision to have a child that is kind of selfish. And I say selfish not in a value judgment kind of way. I'm trying to see this objectively, which is we create children for ourselves. We don't create children for children. They don't exist, so they get no value out of being, born essentially. But we create children for ourselves. It's a desire to perpetuate, our name, our lineage, our bloodline, and all of these things. And so there's something quite there's a desire to really create people of in our own image when we make children, and because there's such a desire to create people of our own in our own image, there's something that feels destabilizing when they behave not exactly the way we want them to, because it's like, well, you've come from me and I've made you and you're of my DNA, and so how can you possibly be your own entire person? Why can't you function? So it's really difficult. There's a real sense of control that comes in there, because it's like, well, I've made you literally out of pieces of me, when actually the truth is that once the baby's out of the system, no longer share a digestive system. Once the baby's been birthed, their digestive system is their own, their blood circulation system is their own. They no longer share that. But that cutting of the umbilical cord is a very real thing, that metaphor of like literally cutting and seeing them as their own separate individuals. And I think a lot of time when parents, feel the sense of like, well, do this, and, a kid can be 18, 20, 22 years old, and there's still a desire to keep them close, and there's still a desire to want to control all of that. It comes from this really primal urge of, I made you out of me. So how could you really be very different? Instead of recognizing that, well, we create something and then we let it out into the world as its own separate entity. So that enmeshment control thing that you're talking about is very real. And it really comes from the whole process of how we biologically birth children. Even if we adopt children, it's, well, I chose you. I chose to give you my home and my name and my nourishment. So there's a real sense of entitlement, which is really misguided, when it comes to parenting, which really lends itself to that kind of control.
Yeah. And again, the control leads to, are you going to be a good girl? Are you going to be a good boy? Are you going to listen to mommy? Are you going to make mommy happy? So it's mostly
it comes down to, are you going to be like me? Because what does good girl, a good boy mean? And what is doing what I ask you to do really mean? Will you be like me? Will you be in my image? And there's something very destabilizing when a child becomes their own person, but they're meant to become their own person. But the shame, I always imagine that the parents are transferring onto their children in that moment. That shame is, how can this being that I created now want to be its own separate thing? What does that say about me? How can I be abandoned in this moment? It's this really primal part that gets stoked of, I made this and it's leaving me. And it's becoming its own entity, and I'm not being listened to. So, all of that stuff of listen to me, what I really hear when parents say, they can only listen to me, they can only do this. What I really hear is that they can only be like.
And we see that as young as children are about 2.5, 3, and when they start putting on their own clothes and they start putting on costumes, and they say, well, today I'm going to wear these red boots with the pink shorts and the yellow shirt, and that's how I'm going to be. And the parent is like, no, How can you do that? I can't let you be that emotionally robust child. I can't let you go out like that. What are people going to think of me? How can
Yeah.
you?
We're
So,
tied together. We're associated together. You're a part of me. So if people see you dressed wonky, wonky, what will that say about me as a parent and my choices? Absolutely.
and yet when you do step out and when everybody is looking and you couldn't be bothered who's looking and why they're looking, you just see that child just loving every moment of being outside dressed as if it's October and there's gonna be like this wind chill coming in from somewhere, and they're absolutely loving it, jumping in the mud, doing everything. So Nida, you work with a lot of children, right?
Mm.
Um, and I'll come back to the cycle of shame. But when you are in talks with children, what are the most common signs of shame do you see?
So, shame. So I'm going to keep it very general here and very easy, like mota cheese, right?
Hmm.
Because there are a lot of soft signs of shame. But to keep it simplest, I think the most obvious thing that stands out to me is I'll either see a child get very big or a child get very small. And I'll explain what that means. Is that like shame lends itself to either hiding or hiding by growing so big. So shame makes us want to hide, and we either hide by expanding to fill up everything so that the shame becomes a very, very, very minuscule part that's buried underneath, or we hide by completely shrinking ourselves really, really down so we become the size of that little shame kernel. And so what I'll notice in children is either like really loud, rebellious, what we would call acting out behavior, um, oppositional defiance, writing on things, getting into trouble, pushing boundaries. Or I'll see children who've really shrunk themselves, withdrawn, quiet, even the little body posture, hunched over, difficulty with making eye contact, um, taking a lot of time to respond to what is asked or in conversation, because there's a lot of anxiety about, will I say the wrong thing, what is the appropriate thing to say here. And so to keep it simplest, what I can see is that I'll either see children get very big or very small, and there's a developmentally appropriate way to be for most children, and when I'll see a child be very big or very small, I'll usually start looking for those kind of other shame soft signs.
Um, so, and which brings me to now to the cycle of shame, right? What it is and how do we break it? And we discussed that it's such a big thing and it's such a repetitive thing, right, that it keeps happening. But if you were to say to somebody, okay, this is you are stuck in a cycle of shame, how would you
Hmm.
explain that to them?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. It is a really complicated thing to tell someone, well, you're stuck in a cycle of shame. And of course, that's the reality of it as well. I think a way to help people see that they're stuck in a cycle of shame um, we always say that the role of therapy is to really hold up a mirror, you know? So therapy is a space where somebody can kind of, in a non-judgmental, open space that feels really safe, that they're able to see themselves from like almost like an objective third perspective, or at least everybody deserves that experience in therapy. And so first, it's about drawing a person's attention to the fact that there's a lot that they're carrying that is not theirs. And shame is one of those things. Is that we all have a natural amount of shame that we're born with, but there's a lot of shame that we pick up through our lives, and it shows itself, like I said, through the getting big or getting small. And by having kind of like, if I'm a mirror to somebody, it'll be those little moments where I'll see the vulnerability inside the bigness. And I'll catch that moment of vulnerability inside a person's kind of big acting out behavior. And I'll hone in on that and I'll show that to the person and say, here, I notice this moment of softness, and I'll work with that little vulnerability part, because that's the part that feels real and true. That's the part that really kind of expands itself and becomes big. That's the part that's really vulnerable. So a person starts getting in touch with their true core by seeing kind of those signs reflected back from their person. So I'll reflect back the moments of truth and vulnerability. And then a lot of it is psychoeducation, helping a person understand the kinds of messages that they got when they were growing up. Where did this idea come from? Where did you hear that for the first time? How old were you when you learned that this is the way that you are, or when you got this message? And then people start understanding the kind of messages that have been given to them. And then they begin to say, okay, how many of these messages make sense? How many of these messages don't make sense? And we think we can only do this with adults, but that's not true. Like I said, like you also said, I was like, I work with a lot of children, and maybe not in the same language. I won't say, hey, when did you learn that message to an 8-year-old? But I'll ask that 8-year-old, hey, when did you decide that this is what you like, that you like pink or that you like yellow? Who picked your clothes for you today? Who picks where you want to go for dinner? It's about little things it's about little things about understanding how much is that person's identity and how much is something that has been layered onto them. And then the older we get, the more we realize how much is ours and how much has just been passed on to us. And once we know that, then the space opens to make a choice to say, okay, how much of this do I need to continue to carry, and how much of this can I let go of because it's not really mine, it was given to me. That may
So
be
it's more about the shaming behaviors, right? Like
yeah.
when we're discussing the shaming behaviors, and when you said that layered onto, when the child feels that it's being layered onto me, or the adult feels that their parent, who's much older than them, is layering on another a part onto them. But do you think that sometimes there could be a parent who's probably addictive or abusive, or they're not they're so they are not shaming the child, but they are carrying a vice or a personal lifestyle where the child is kind of adopting the shame? So
So yeah, I don't think a lot of parents intend to pass on shame. So we can pass on shame verbally, we can pass on shame non-verbally. So we can pass on shame by saying things like, don't do that, don't wear that, what's wrong with you? But there's so many subtle non-verbal ways to pass on shame, and there's so many unintentional ways to pass on shame, and that can happen on a non-verbal level. So for a parent who's, and I'm going to go with addiction here. For a parent who's caught in their own addiction, they may be so caught in their addiction that they don't even realize, right? They don't even realize what they're passing on to their kid. It's not like it's their intention, right? But a child can carry shame in multiple ways from a parent who's an addict. One is the shame of having an out of control parent who maybe cannot parent, and just carrying that shame around of people will know, they'll see, they'll hear, they'll wonder where I'm from, what's wrong with me, that mommy or daddy can't be present with me, that they're kind of away in this behavior that they're always doing. Do they notice me? And in another way, a child can pick up shame from an addict parent is that if that parent is an addict, chances are that they've gone into what their addiction is because they're running away for some shame of their own. And then from a desire to kind of hide from that, they'll be in something else. But that shame, it's going to go somewhere. Shame, our difficult feelings, they demand to be felt someplace. And so a lot of that stuff, children are very intuitive. They're picking up cues from their parents all the time. And so they'll pick up on the fact that mom and dad are not okay and they're running away from something. And they'll pick up a lot of that anxiety and that shame that's buried deep inside the parents. So it's complicated because they'll have their own shame about the way their parent is. And then they'll be picking up on some of the shame that is inside the parent as well. And it'll become complex, it'll become multifaceted. And so it's not an intentional passing. We pass shame on without realizing it, non-verbally, very often.
And you also mentioned here social shame.
Yeah.
Log kya kahenge?
Yeah.
What are they gonna think of me? This socially induced or socially acquired shame that a lot of young adults carry with them, heavy baggages, and they're unable to unpack it. Why do you think that now therapy is being really respected and brought on and treated like, you need to go into therapy. You need to sort of do this self-care step for yourself and um, introduce yourself to it so that you can guide yourself and get out of whatever, or just think about things. Why do we carry the stigma around being able to go into therapy or allowing our children to go into therapy?
You know, I like that you ended that with allowing our children to go into therapy, because think about this. What might it mean for a parent to be really candid and honest and say, my child is struggling? Maybe they're struggling with something that, even though I love them, even though I'm a parent, even though I may be trying my best, my child is struggling with something that I cannot necessarily be able to help with. And maybe they need somebody else for that, right? As a parent, if we hold on to that sense of, I've created this person, they're in my image, I can give them everything, they're entirely my responsibility, I can take care of them, it can be a real sense of shame of, why can't I be enough for my child? You know, what is it that I'm unable to do? It's so much of that shame of how I feel as a parent. If my child needs therapy, on some level, I have to admit that perhaps something has gone wrong somewhere. I have missed something. And so there's so much of their own personal shame that comes from failing as a parent that it can transfer over into kind of the therapeutic process and say, no, not therapy for my child. And there's a real sense of like, especially in our culture, it's a don't air your dirty laundry to other people, keep it in the family. So if you're struggling with somebody, if you're struggling with something in the family, well, we sort it in the family. Kisi bahar wale ko, let's not get an outsider. We're going to tell somebody off the street our business. This is our business. And so there's shame of an outsider who's going to hear. And then there's the big shame of what does that mean for me as a parent? And how have I failed? And this other person's going to come and tell me maybe about how to parent my child. And so that shame as well. And so that all of that kind of feeds into why it's so difficult sometimes for parents to be okay with their young child going to therapy. It brings up too much of their own shame.
And even though a parent wants to help their child and be free from this chain burden of shame, whether it was induced by yourself or by certain circumstances, shame does translate into fear.
Yeah,
and that is a really, really difficult area to sort of go into, because it could be, like I said, it could be sexual, it could be codependency, shame in terms of guilt. A lot of parents that we've been recently speaking to have not been able to talk to their children about sexuality because there's so much shame attached to it. Don't talk about it. Especially on this platform where we have differently abled children and especially abled parents. And it's a huge thing anyway. We're having a different child in the house, and now that different child is coming off age and puberty is coming around, and you're like, I don't want to address this. I don't want to address that my child is going to be passing through puberty, and so don't touch it, don't do this. So fear, when fear settles in, how do we go about that?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. And I want to say something that, like, there's a unique set of shame behaviors that I'll notice even in some parents of differently abled children. Like, and again, I think it's unintentional. All parents may be trying their best at their different levels when they can, but there's a real sense of my child is here. I thought my child was going to be a certain way. And when I was pregnant, perhaps I had hopes and dreams of how this child would be. And then this wonderfully unique being comes into the world with wonderfully unique features that perhaps are very different than the image that the parents had in their head. And there's a lot of shame of the identity being attached to that as well, and there's a real desire and a real fear to, okay, well, now something really unique has happened, and how do we protect? And so the fear is, let's keep everything as okay and stable as possible. So we bring up sexuality, it's going to be scary. It'll add one more thing to an already full plate. Our plate is full. We have a differently able child. We're managing functionality. We're managing this. We don't need this big thing to come and rock the boat here, right? I think a huge part of addressing fear, and I'm going to say this especially for parents with differently abled children, is a lot of that is fear that has nothing to do with the kid. It's entirely our own. A lot of the fear that parents have for their child's well-being, a lot of it are fears that the child doesn't have. It may not be in the child's awareness. The child may not have, the cognitive or the emotional capacity to make those connections, but that's parents' own fear of, will my child be okay or whatever. So a lot of it is support for the parents. Fear really tells us that there's a part of us that's worried. Fear lets us know we care. Fear is wisdom, Even when fear comes from shame, what it really tells us is that we're worried, and we don't worry about things that don't matter to us. We worry about things that do matter to us. We worry about things that we really care about. And so a lot of addressing fear is to give space to it, to give room and support to the parents to say that, like, well, this shows that you really love your child. You really care about this child. You care about this child's well-being, and the child may not be worried about their well-being, because for a child, it's like, well, this is me and this is my normal. But parents have a certain concept of typical. Parents may have a certain concept of normal. And so a lot of that is just support for the parent to have room to experience that fear, to have support groups to be able to kind of, experience that fear. And most of all, to let them know that their fear comes from a place of caring, but perhaps the way that it shows itself is a way that's not entirely constructive or skillful or helpful. So it's about validating the feeling, because the feeling is real and it matters. But to differentiate between the feeling of fear and the way fear shows itself, so we can validate fear and still say, well, what is the really skillful, helpful way to kind of work through it anyways? Is that it shows that you care, and that's a beautiful thing. But maybe one way of caring is to empower the child and equip the child with knowledge about sexuality, so that the kid's able to say, yeah, this is what's right and this is what's not right. I'm not okay with someone getting this close to me. I'm not okay with this stranger. And we can still have our fear and use that in a way that's skillful and constructive to empower rather than disempower.
And you just mentioned giving space.
Yeah.
Giving space also sort of talks about boundaries a lot, which most of our parents kind of like get a little angsty with, because they're like, wait, what? No. What do you mean give space? I own you, right? How can I give you space? I own you, right? How can we help parents understand what to model as to not shame their children?
What to model as to not shame them? Well, first of all, I think that it really helps when parents have had the opportunity to be able to sift through their own experience and process their own sources of shame. Because really, I mean, there's nothing kind of more beautiful than that. So if parents have had the opportunity to process their own sources of shame and to separate kind of what they're able to carry, they can kind of make sure that they show up for their children in a way where they're not transferring shame onto them. I think that's the biggest thing, If parents can model kind of being anxious, but being anxious in a way where the children know it's not the child's business. They can see their parents be anxious, and yet it's not the kid's responsibility. The kids don't have to worry about the parents. The parents can be anxious, but that's fine. They got it. And so parents really need to model a sense of this goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. It's an unequal relationship, and it's unequal in all senses. Parents have the responsibility. They hold the reins, which also means that when, the flood's coming, the parents say, it's your just job to hide in the corner. We got the door to keep the flood out. So a lot of that is modeling resilience and strength, even when they don't feel it, simply because the power balance is unequal, And so self-care for the parents, so that they're able to kind of model resilience for the kids. Parents who take the time and the opportunity to work on themselves, Very often parents will come in with me and say, here's my child, here's a problem behavior, we leave them, fix them. I think, can we give this over to you? And at that moment, like, okay, so they're really transferring their shame onto me now. Like, here, this is your problem. And the idea is that like a child 7 or 8, it's just as important to work with the parent as the child. And so a lot of it will be about, again, like I said, and I was like, parents with self-care, parents with their emotional regulation strategies, parents who've taken the time to process their own material, and then they'll be models of resilience for the kids. So when a child comes in, you're not working with the kid, you're really working with the parents and then the kid.
And what kind of response do you get, Nida, when you're like, well, I know your child is here, but let me address how are we going to heal the shame from your childhood?
Yeah, it's a tactful way. I think a lot of it is, look, this is the slack I'll cut all parents, because maybe it seems I'm being a little harsh on them.
Yeah.
You know, Parents don't worry about the children unless they care about them. Any parent who has ever made contact with their therapist, they're phenomenal because they've noticed, they've acknowledged, and they fundamentally want to do something right by their kid. So already those are parents who are deeply invested, and that's a beautiful thing. I think that that's the starting off point for a conversation with parents, is to acknowledge the fact that there's something really beautiful and invested about them, that they're even there. And so I think making that connection with them allows the deeper conversations to say, how amazing. I can see that you care. You're here. You've taken out time and money and energy to find somebody to work with your kid. So you must be really committed. So let's see how we can really make this process work. If you're this committed, I trust that there are things that you are also kind of wanting to do and looking at. And then psychoeducating them. Usually if a parent feels and they know that the therapist is connected to them and they recognize they're caring, that goes a long way to having those bigger conversations about the work that the parent needs to do. They're more amenable to it because they know that it comes not from a place of scolding, but it comes from a place of recognizing that they really care. We're only there for an hour a week. Parents are there like 24 hours a day. I mean, they
Yeah.
do the heavy lifting. We don't do the heavy lifting. They do the heavy lifting. We know that. Yeah.
And you said addressing the bigger things, letting go of shame. People could have been, and when I say people, I'm saying individuals, parents, children. We can be in therapy for years and
Mm.
yet unfolding, unpacking, addressing, accepting, acknowledging all these things, just like, Um, so somebody on the group had asked, well, can you ask, how do we just let go of it? How do we let go of shame? So I'm going to let you answer that.
How do we let go? Well, we can only let go of something that we know that we're carrying, right? I can't let go of something unless I'm aware that I'm carrying it. So the first step is to get in touch with what I'm carrying, to get in touch with the weight of it. How long have I been carrying this? That work, I wish it had a time limit, but that work is deeply profound work. It can be a couple of sessions, it can be a while. To grieve the losses of the things that have been passed on to me, to come to terms with how long I've been carrying it. Once I'm aware of what I'm carrying, then the space opens for me to let go of it. The truth is that we have to learn how much we still have to gain from holding what we're holding on to, and how much we have to gain from letting go of what we're holding on to. And the truth is that there's certain things that we hold on to because they still serve us in some way. Maybe some wounds are really deep. And so there's certain parts of our shame that we have to hold on to for a while longer because it doesn't feel safe to let go of them. But the more we get in touch with our inner resources and strengths, the safer it feels to let go of it in pieces. There's the short answer is that I'll say that we let go of shame in pieces. We don't let go of it all at once. We get in touch with it to see what we're carrying, how much we're carrying, how long we've been carrying it. We see how much of that has served us. We see how much of that has caused pain to us. We grieve the losses for what we've lost. We celebrate, what is provided for us. And when we're able to feel empowered and strong by learning how to navigate life without it, we slowly let it go in pieces. I wish there was a one magical solution, but Yeah.
And there isn't, which is why I chose you to address this, because I mean, it is work in progress. We are all work in progress. Nobody came with a manual, and people who do write manuals, even they're work in progress. There's somewhere when we were discussing transferring over the shame, right? When a parent is aware of some of the shame that they carry or that they have from their childhood or some kind of toxicity that they want to address to, but they don't want to transfer over it to their children because it would damage their child's self-esteem and their child's self-worth. And that awareness is really, really healthy because you know of it. How can you help the parent, or how does the parent help themselves not transfer it over?
So I'm glad you asked that, because if there's one tool, like if I always think that if there's one thing I could say to all the parents in the world at the same time, it would be something related to this, right? Which is for parents to learn to separate a child from their behavior. So for example, if a kid is writing on the wall, we can say, what's wrong with you? That's terrible. You're a terrible kid. Ganda bacha, acha bacha, sharam kar, right? Or we can kind of say, make it about that specific behavior. Look, I love you, but this really writing on the wall, that is just not something that that's not something that feels appropriate. It's hard work. I'll have to clean it. It's a lot of work. It's not very pleasant. And so a kid realizes, okay, I can be a great human being, and yet I can do a behavior that is not great. And so to me, the biggest way, if a parent has the awareness and they have a desire to not want to transfer their shame over, they can start by speaking in specific terms to their children about behavior rather than identity, to be careful of the language that we use, so that every time we're setting boundaries with children, we're setting boundaries around behavior, not around identity. This specific thing that you did, and this works both ways, even in terms of praise. Not, oh, you're so amazing. That's really overwhelming for a child. People pleasing. Oh my God, how do I stay amazing? What did I do that's amazing? But to say, I really appreciate, that you came and you smiled at me this morning and you gave me a hug. It was nice to ask. It was nice to get a hug without asking for it. That's something really specific. And similarly, it was difficult for me, and I don't know if I'm entirely okay with the fact that you spoke to me in that tone of voice when we were having that conversation. So specific behavior is not shaming. Shame is about identity. So a big place to start is to start speaking to children about behavior rather than identity.
And as we spoke about this transference, Mariam also had sent a question in, how does one recognize the thin line between imposing shame and the necessary boundaries of discipline? Sometimes it's quite blurred, and one might often overstep.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
good question. Um, so I think that there's a huge difference. I think that we need boundaries, but tone of how we set boundaries matters a lot. Boundaries are really necessary for children, because children really suffer and chaotic and don't have a sense of self without boundaries. So boundaries, nurturing, right? Healthy limits, nurturing, and affirmation. When these three things are present together, we're able to create really healthy conditions to set boundaries. So healthy limits, meaning that there's some sense of concept of structure and rules, but done in a nurturing way. And there's enough affirmation and enough love and praise that goes. We can't have just affirmation, because then children become, self-indulgent, and that leads to a whole other host of problems. We can't have just nurturing without any healthy limits, because otherwise children don't always learn about safety and risk management. And we can't have just setting healthy limits without any nurturing or affirmations, because otherwise it's shame, 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 shame behavior. So the trick is about managing the balance between these, about having healthy limits, but having a nurturing and an affirmation stance to really be able to balance those. So what I'll say in response to that question is that she asked, like, how do we differentiate between healthy boundaries and kind of shaming behavior? It's the tone, it's the balance of these three things. How much are nurturing and affirmations part of the limits that are being set? When it's done in a shaming way, when it's done in that language, without the nurturing and the affirmation, that becomes shaming. But when boundaries are set with love and nurturing and affirmation, they're not shaming.
All of a sudden I feel like I'm back. I'm just missing the 19 other people who would sit in the semicircle with me. Many of them who are tuned in right now. Adil says hi. He's written hi twice, so I said I'll say. That to sort of like, bring our session to close, I'd sort of listed down, you get these signs. We talked about signs of shaming or symptoms or when children come in. So I'd listed out 7 things which come out most often. They come about is when unknowingly when parents are shaming their children is when we encroach their independence, judge their choices, tell them not to cry, set extremely high expectations. Like you mentioned, it's not just about toning it down. It's like toning it up and saying, oh, you are so amazing. And now how do I be amazing every day? Publicly disciplining children, laughing at your child in public or otherwise. And again, you said tone is everything. Telling them that they're not a big girl, they're not a big boy, they're not a good girl, they're not a good boy. And these are the things that I could come up with, like, which are the most common types of shaming that occurs, right? Is there anything that?
Sure.
Sorry.
They're big ones in our culture. Yeah.
They're big ones. They're huge. I had this whole list, and I had sexual shame and puberty shame like at the top of it. Because we have been conversing. The narrative has been, come out of your own shell, come out of your own shame. Do not transfer it over. And so we see so much of it, even in terms of sexual abuse. The sexual abuse cycle continues because there's so much of shame. And when you address the parent or address the child, they're like, no, that's not what it is. You don't get it. So what would you like to leave? I mean, right now, whoever's tuned in, this is going to be playing, and people are going to be tuning in to watch it again and again. What is, like you said, I like to leave, parents with a message. Not just parents, individuals. How to deal with shame and how to address it.
So I'm going to go back to something I said earlier because I think that part merits repeating, right? There's a difference between feeling that a behavior was not okay and feeling like we're not okay, right? It helps us to know that there's certain behaviors we did that aren't okay because that helps us to work on ourselves and grow. That shame place of I'm not okay is the part that's really difficult and debilitating. So for the adults, because I'm assuming grown-ups will be listening to this and are listening to this, for grown-ups, let's listen to the way that we talk to ourselves first, because the way we talk to ourselves is very often the way we talk to other people. So the more often we use that language of I'm so like this, I'm so like that, the greater the chances are that we speak to our children that way too. Right? And so if we want to start getting in touch with our own shame to see about how much we're transferring, let's note how much of that identity compared to behavior language we use for ourselves. How often do we say, I'm like this and I'm like this, as opposed to, oh, I wish I kind of maybe got out of bed an hour earlier instead of, I'm so useless. I can't even get out of bed on time. So start by being kinder to ourselves, and that allows our shame to breathe a little bit more, which means we're less likely to pass it on to somebody else.
Thank you. Words of wisdom. Be kind to yourself. Thank you so much, Nida.
Thank you.
And so many, I don't like to use the word wise, but so many important things said, which I hope parents and individuals can incorporate and understand and address on their own time, since we are under this lockdown and there is a lot of overwhelming and transference of shame happening currently. So I hope parents can take something from this. And thank you so much for your time.
We're about to get destabilized. No one's going to judge us for taking 5 minutes to step back. You said something important. When we're in lockdown and when we're not feeling great, we're more likely to transfer our shame. So before we do that, there's no shame in taking a 5-minute break. Take 5 minutes, even if it's just to go away and breathe. It's a miracle what space can do. Seriously. It buys us time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nida, and I hope we can get you back before this lockdown ends. Get you back so that we can probably converse about a different topic.
Sure. I look forward to it.
I'm on record now.
All right. Take care, Rabia. It was good to see you again.
Much. See you.
Right.
Take care. Bye. And that was the amazing Nida. It's I can keep talking about her. I can keep saying things about her because itna kuch. She gave me so much to think about. She and 19 other students who are now, who you're all listening to me. It completely changed our perspective towards our own selves, and हम किस तरह सोचते हैं, किस तरह पेरेंट करते हैं, कितना शेम हम कैरी करते हैं, क्यों कैरी करते हैं, क्यों उसको एड्रेस नहीं करते. So many beautiful things were discussed today. I hope that you can go back, hear it again, think about it, and be kind to yourselves, be kind to your mind. So once again, thank you so much, Nida, for giving us this time and this space. And इससे पहले मैं बताती चलूं कि कल 5 बजे. So it's been like the weekend has been like two powerful ladies. Tomorrow we have Raunak Lakhani. क्या कुछ कहें उनके बारे में. She is a wonderful personality, and tomorrow universally Mother's Day celebrate किया जाता है. जो celebrate कर रहे हैं, जो समझते हैं कि उनको ये दिन या ये चीज मजे की लगती है. So Raunak Lakhani is going to be with us. I will be talking so endlessly about her resilience, about the work she's done. Special Olympics Pakistan, क्या कुछ उन्होंने नहीं किया है. So tomorrow Raunak Lakhani is going to be with us at 5 o'clock. I'm really looking forward to it. And to take back, आज इतना heavy topic था कि every time we think about shame, जैसे कि निदा ने कहा, जब हम वो word use करते हैं शर्मिंदा, shame, एक heaviness वैसे ही feel होती है. तो क्यों ना अपने आप को liberate करें, क्यों ना अपने आप के साथ अच्छा सलूक करें, अपने mind के साथ, अपने दिल के साथ. So be good to yourselves and be kind to others. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you tomorrow. Khuda Hafiz.